Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Measuring and Improving Cyber Defense Using the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, sponsored by Anomaly, Attack IQ, Corelight, Cyberproof, ExtraHop, Infoblox, Logarithm, RSA, and Threat Quotient. My name is Carol, author of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is John Hubbard, Certified SANS Instructor and Course Author. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to John.
All right, thank you, Carol. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So I'm really excited about this presentation today because MITRE ATT&CK is, as you all are probably aware, one of the biggest things happening within the information security industry and within blue teaming in general, which is my specialty. So first, quick introduction. As Carol said, my name is John Hubbard. I'm a SANS author and certified instructor. And the classes that I teach and have authored all revolve very closely around this topic. So this is something that I'm very passionate about. I have some experience with implementing in my own SOC and other teams. I'm the author of the Blue Team Fundamentals course in Management 551, which is a brand new SOC management course that also mentions these topics and kind of how to operationalize them. And so this webcast, we're going to go over several of the techniques that I've used in my career and several of the best practices that are out there for using MITRE ATT&CK and leveraging the wealth of information that it provides towards improving our teams. So without further ado, today's agenda, first we're going to do a quick intro to MITRE ATT&CK for those who might have not seen it before, and some important updates that actually just dropped about, 13 days ago now. There are some fundamental shifts in what MITRE ATT&CK has been arranged around. And so if you haven't seen those and you haven't looked at the matrix in the last 2 weeks, you might want to take another look because it will look considerably different than what you're used to in the past. Then we're going to talk about how we can use ATT&CK to improve operations. And so the three main things we're going to cover on that front are going to be cyber threat intelligence. It's obviously an amazing framework for this. MITRE has put in a ton of work. I have no inherent kind of link to MITRE, but I'm a big fan of what they have done here. They've provided a real big service to blue teams and kind of InfoSec in general here, just around the cyber threat intelligence aspect alone. But some of the other things you can do with MITRE ATT&CK as a framework, data source gap identification, and it can really do an awesome job guiding you with analytic testing. And so we're going to cover how all of those three things can be done, because those I see are the kind of primary three things that you can do with MITRE ATT&CK to really launch from a SOC that maybe doesn't have as much guidance, that does have a lot of guidance in a very short amount of time using MITRE ATT&CK. After that, we'll talk about some common challenges, keys to success, and the tools and resources you can leverage to help make this as smooth and easy as possible. So that's where we're going with this webcast. So first off, we all know this, right? Security is a very difficult problem, and there's a number of reasons that is. One is it's just incredibly complex, right? Understanding what your network is doing, what your endpoints are doing alone is a big enough challenge. But on top of that, we have to keep track of what our actual attackers, specifically our attackers, not attackers in general, but who's after us as our organization is concerned, what they are capable of. What is relevant to those specific threat groups that we expect to be seeing attacking our organization, and getting that proper visibility so when they use those techniques against us, we actually can pick up on them, right? If we can't see them from the start, we just have no chance at all from the beginning. And so, we start off in a very difficult position here. And on top of all of this, we may think we've gotten this right. We may have thought we have profiled our attackers and bought a bunch of expensive tools and all sorts of great stuff, but do we know that they work, right? When the rubber hits the road, are those alerts really going to go off? And so we want to talk about how MITRE is going to help, the ATT&CK framework is going to help us solve a bunch of these problems here and guide us down this path to kind of sanity check our ability to see the right things, collect the right data, profile our attackers, and then test that all of this is going to work in a number of different ways. So, MITRE ATT&CK, what is it? In short, it is a knowledge base of what attackers can do when they approach our network. Generally, the things we focus on in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix are going to be post-exploitation techniques, but it does cover a little bit of everything from the whole recon stage all the way through. But largely what we're talking about when we talk about attack, and in this presentation as well, is going to be stuff that occurs post-exploitation. So once they've landed that phishing email, once they're doing that lateral movement, command and control, credential dumping, all that kind of stuff. And one of the big benefits of this, it provides a common taxonomy that we can refer to this collectively as an industry with. Before, the situation is kind of like every SOC was an island, right? We all kind of had to figure this out on our own, come up with our own names for these things. Maybe we knew about some techniques, maybe we didn't. MITRE is helping us standardize that, and it's based on real world observations. They take input from the community. When people say, hey, we just saw something new, they're adding it. And so the idea is it's constantly up to date, right? Reflecting the most realistic, serious, what people are seeing in reality attack tactics that are out there. So all that's fantastic, and the best part of all, it is free to use for all and freely accessible because that is how MITRE is operating it. So great resource for everyone for intelligence, analytics, assessment, and all of that good stuff. Now the two key things that it's broken down into are tactics and techniques. And the difference between these two is the tactics are basically what is being accomplished. So they're going to be high level categories, like on top here we have privilege escalation, persistence, execution, initial access, and command and control, exfil, and other things are in there. Those are the things that attackers need to do when they get into your environment, generally after post-exploitation, except for initial access, of course. And then the techniques are going to be how, specifically, they can get those things done. And so privilege escalation can be done through accessibility features, apps or DLLs, and all that good stuff. And so it's meant to be an exhaustive list of every single way that privilege escalation is known to be done by attackers that have been seen in the wild, right? Now, I mentioned a big shift. Previous to 13 days ago, I believe July 8th is when they officially released this. The beta had been out for a while, but there had been tactics and there were techniques, right? It was parent and child kind of relationship, parent tactics, techniques aligned under each of them. Now it has gotten one step more complicated, but also way better, in my opinion. The major shift is that they have introduced what they call sub-techniques. So now we're going to see something like execution, and all the tactics are really the same, but each technique, as these things were getting implemented and built into tools, MITRE started to see how this was being used, and they're like, you know what, I think we can arrange this in a little bit better way. And we saw that there were kind of smaller umbrellas within the large umbrella that we could still subgroup things and make it even more meaningful. And so that's exactly what they did. So execution as a tactic, for example, now has a technique of command and scripting interpreter, which has sub-techniques of PowerShell, AppleScript, Bash, VBScript, Python, Windows Command Shell, all that. Interprocess communication, sub-techniques of component object model, dynamic data exchange. This is awesome, right? Because years after ATT&CK came out, they really understood what people were going to do with this. And along the way, you know, the first iteration of ATT&CK was great, but there were some techniques that were a little vague, like data encryption. Well, what do you do about that, right? And so when you have vague things mixed with things that were very specific, it didn't quite make sense. And this rearrangement fixes those problems. We have now organization that is idealized to the type of analysis we are actually seeing teams do with the MITRE ATT&CK framework nowadays. And so this will be a benefit. The downside to this is we already have a lot of software that has been released, both commercial and open source, that is arranged around the original schema. And this is now an additional, or I mean, a change in schema. So everything had a unique number before. It was like T1007 or something like that. Now we have T1007 dot and then some more numbers. And so the way that these have been programmed and the way that our tools have been categorizing things into these techniques are going to have to be updated in a pretty significant way. If you have a use case database, for example, that was tracking everything against the old schema, well, some of those techniques may have disappeared. Some of those techniques may have become parent level techniques, and some of those techniques may have become child level techniques. And so MITRE does have a blog post that explains exactly what they did and the process they followed. So if you're struggling with this right now, there are ways to understand what was done and how to most easily move into this new shift. But this is a really exciting thing, and I'm really glad that they did it, but we will have some growing pains, at least for a little bit, to support this, but this is an awesome change. Other things that are included within the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it's not just tactics and techniques. MITRE has taken very, very meticulous notes of a lot of different threat reports from vendors and otherwise, and taken all of these tactics and techniques and come up with a set of groups that are also discussed and pinned the tactics and techniques to those threat groups. So for example, if you see a report about your industry that says CarbonAC as a group is interested in you, well, you can go into the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base, click on CarbonAC, and then see all the tactics and techniques that they're known to use, some of the software they use, and other various things that you need to know about them if you are particularly worried about that group. And so it starts to build into a threat intelligence database. So in this case, we have CarbonAC. Threat group mainly targets banks, sometimes referred to as Fin7. We have associated groups. We all know the group game with threat intelligence is kind of difficult. One vendor will have their own naming convention that's totally separate than a second vendor. And so MITRE has tried to consolidate all of these things, and where there's overlap, they mention it. Where there's associated groups, they try to mention it and put all that together. So it helps you understand who the groups are and organizes the tactics and techniques those groups use. Now, each of those things also come with software. All of these attack groups, well, many of these attack groups have their own custom kinds of tools. And so when we come up with CarbonAC uses their own custom tool. Maybe it's Baby Shark, for example. Yes, I picked that on purpose so everyone would have to hum the tune in their head now. Sorry about that. Baby Shark, right? Microsoft Visual Basic script-based malware family. This is a way to understand the threat group's actual software that they use, and then the tactics and techniques implemented by a specific piece of software. So we're breaking it down even further, right? Groups may use 3 or 4 different types of software, and then that software may implement several different types of techniques, all of which are now listed and sorted amongst all of the information that they have built into this. So this is a really, really great and detailed set of data. Aside from the outward-looking threat information, we also have the inward-looking kind of what can we do about it information that's built in as well. And so in the attack matrix, each technique also has mitigations, data sources, and other key information about what you can do to detect and stop that technique from working. So in this case, I pulled this one from the BITS, the Background Intelligence Transfer Service, which is a way that attackers sometimes use to execute software. It says, hey, if you're worried about this, well, we can use filtering of network traffic, we can modify the operating system configuration, we can use user account management, and it tells us and guides us how we can get in the way of the tactics that we care about. So great resource for defending yourself as well as threat intelligence, and not only preventing this stuff from happening, but detecting when it happens as well, right? In defense, we always talk about prevention is ideal, detection is a must. And so yes, we want to implement all the mitigations we can, but sometimes we can't mitigate stuff. So how are we going to detect it when it does occur? Data sources, right? Each of these has their own list of how you can detect these things in action. So BITS jobs again. If you look at the data sources, you can pick this up through packet capture, process command line parameters, process monitoring, and all that good stuff. Right now, the data sources are not implemented as objects for each individual item, which means dealing with them kind of programmatically is a little bit difficult, but they're going to change that soon. So if you're looking to do some of the stuff that I'm going to show in a couple slides here, be aware that working with data sources in a programmatic way is also something that's on the roadmap for 2020 for the attack data map. Now, the different types of attack that are out there. Lastly, to mention this, we have the enterprise attack model. This is the one that you will almost always see unless you are going to look for something specialized use case, right? Enterprise is our matrix that has mostly post-exploitation stage attacks. It's broken into cloud, it's broken into Linux and Windows, and even within cloud, we have AWS and GCP and all that kind of stuff kind of separately listed. Beyond that, we have mobile. If you're worried about mobile attacks specifically, we have the mobile attack matrix. ICS covers those for industrial control systems. And we have pre-attack, which is our pre-exploitation phase activities that are also put in there as well. according to MITRE, their 2020 roadmap, or somewhere in the not too distant future, will include merging all of these things into one, I guess, matrix to rule them all, so to speak, right? This is eventually planned to become all of one so that you can just kind of say what type of thing you're looking for and it will filter it down. But as of right now, they're kind of different websites and they're all out there. And so whatever you're most interested in, you can just kind of go to that dedicated site and pull those bits of information. Now for us, why are we here today? We're talking about improving operations with ATT&CK. So what are the questions that ATT&CK is going to answer for us that we need to know and have good solid answers to that are going to help us improve operations, right? One of the big things is what are the actions the attackers are going to engage in? If you have a blue team that has never taken or done any kind of pen testing, which is pretty common because of course we weren't trained as red teamers, we were trained as blue teamers often if we work in a SOC, you might not know what's possible. And so one big question is what can the attackers even do, right? We need to arrange that around the different types of specific threat groups that are out there. And so we talked about the threat groups. Those are collected and listed as well with all the categorizations, the tools that they use, the capabilities of those specific tools, and then how we can detect and how we can mitigate that potential damage. So this is one of the biggest things, right? It is a all-encompassing source of outward-facing kind of what are the threats, what are those threats capable of, and what are those threats tools specifically doing in terms of tactics and techniques. And so it helps us get in the way and kind of align defense, and then tells us, here are the mitigations, here are the ways to detect those things. So for using ATT&CK to improve operations, this is the way that I've broken this down, which aligns with some of the threat blog, or the blog posts that MITRE has put out there that have additional kind of detail on some of these things. Like I said, this is a big gift to the blue team, right? One of the big items, cyber threat intelligence, just knowing what's out there. You may or may not have a dedicated cyber threat intelligence team, and if you don't, this is an enormous gift to you because that is a ton of work. Trust me, reading through threat reports, individually highlighting the tactics and techniques, taking those, associating those with the group name for the attack, and then associating those group names with other group names that may or may not overlap, that's painful, right? But that's the work that threat intelligence analysts have to do, and fortunately, MITRE has done for us in a lot of these cases and made it freely available. The other big thing, standardization. I am wild about blue team standardization. There is this effort, and there's plenty of other tools that are moving to make it such that we live in a world where we can defend using a common language about attacks, use different types of detection techniques that can be generalized, spread out analysis in ways that can be generalized, and all of those things are going to ultimately be a big boon for the blue team, because when someone finds something and we're all using the same language, it's much easier for everyone to block it. So it's doing this important standardization work that I really think contributes to InfoSec as a whole. And then it helps us understand what data sources we need and helps us plan an assessment strategy so that we know our stuff is actually working, right? You never want to be in that position where you're like, well, I thought we had a rule for that and it was going to fire, and then the day comes and it doesn't fire and you realize, oops, someone changed something and it was broken and you didn't know it. So the first item, cyber threat intelligence. When it comes to cyber threat intelligence, as a blue team, as a SOC, as an organization, what you really need to do is prioritize. And so with the details we've talked about in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, obviously this is going to be something that is a big, big time saver for you. What you want to do as a blue team is look outward into the world and say, well, who is most likely to attack me? That's kind of like the first cut, right? What do we have that's important and who wants that sort of thing? And so since this data is something that's encoded as part of ATT&CK, you can leverage ATT&CK heavily to say, well, like, give me an exhaustive list of all the threat groups the industry even knows about in the first place. And then once you start to focus in, you can Google around and say like, oh, well, we're a manufacturing company. Let's see which threat groups are into attacking manufacturing companies. You can click on those threat groups, you can see their capabilities, and we can assume that a threat group is generally going to do something similar in the future to what they've done in the past, because ultimately they are the same group of humans, right? And so that is the key assumption here around threat intelligence. If we know what an attack group has done in the past, we can guess what they're capable of, we can guess what tools they use, we can categorize those tools, and we can customize our defense such that we are optimally suited to defend against the attackers that are most likely to attack us. Said in short, offense needs to inform defense. So the more you know about offense, the better you're going to be at defense. You wouldn't go into a war not knowing anything about who you're going to be fighting against and what your tools are to defend against that mysterious enemy, right? And the same thing is true of cyber defense. And so that is what we want to do with the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So one big thing we can do with ATT&CK is use it as a consumer of intelligence. And this is one thing MITRE says applies to every organization. Blanket statement, no matter how small of a team you are, you can use ATT&CK for this. So if nothing else that I say in this presentation is related, this is going to be something that you definitely can do. The whole point is improving defensive decision making, right? Exactly what I was just saying. Use it to understand your threats, profile those threats, and then prioritize those tactics and techniques that you are most likely to see. So we're going to look at the threat landscape and we're going to narrow it down. And we're going to say, all right, we got APT1, APT3, maybe those are the two groups out there that are most likely to attack me, understand what they do, understand how those tools work and what tactics and techniques they implement, and then learn how to mitigate against those things. And then test ourselves to make sure those mitigations work, or learn how to detect those things and test ourselves to make sure that those detections work. It's all about prioritization and understanding what the capability of the attacker is so that you can put up your best possible defense. If nothing else, you should be doing that at a bare minimum, right? The other thing, once you get a hold on that, well, you're probably going to start generating your own intelligence. You should be. Anytime you create a new case, anytime you see an attack to your organization, there is detail in there that can be harvested, right? You may not be writing super detailed malware reverse engineering, APT categorizing attribution reports, but you still have a little bit of data. And if you can take that data you have and tie it back to the threat groups that have you've already been informed about, well, you're starting to produce additional intelligence. And so the whole idea of threat intelligence is it's not just a one-way street. It's not produced and then consumed by the SOC only. The SOC then sees things, does incident response, and incident response needs to feed back to threat intelligence. And so once you get to that point, you should be producing this intelligence as well and adding it to your own information, whether you're sharing it or not, back into this categorized kind of framework. And so ideally, if companies are doing this and they see a new attack method, maybe they share it with ATT&CK, and ATT&CK says, we have a new persistence mechanism out there. They add it and everyone knows about it, right? So you can help contribute to this framework, or if not contributing publicly to it, at least making your own internal defense better based on this. And the whole process is, consider what you've seen in your network, consider what you've read about in the news, highlight and extract those techniques, and then use that to feed your prioritization and testing mechanism that you're going to be using for assessing your SOC. Other things we can do. Data source gap identification. Since ATT&CK tells you how to detect these things, it will say, if you want to detect this particular persistence mechanism, you need to pick up this type of log source, which means if you can come up with a prioritized set of techniques that you need, well, then you can extract the data sources needed to pick those techniques up, and then you can say, well, are we collecting all of this data that we need to be collecting, right? As I say here, prioritized techniques plus the data sources that are built into those techniques gives you data priorities, right? If you find that all of your techniques are going to be caught by, let's say, file integrity monitoring or Windows event logs, you better make it your priority to make sure that those things at least are picked up, right? Otherwise, you're really shooting yourself in the foot. And so that's what we want to do with this as well, is identify these data sources that we need to defend against these things that we know or we see are attacking us, and then make sure we're picking those up. So when we look at a specific technique here, they're listed right here, and it may be more than one thing. We have file monitoring, we have process monitoring, process command line parameters, all that sort of stuff. As I mentioned, you can programmatically access the data inside ATT&CK and pull these bits of information out. And with the ability to do that, and I've mentioned some of the tools here, you can Google any of these things and get some of the Python and other clients people have used to pull this information out in a structured way. You can say, all right, pull all the information down through the ATT&CK API, and then show me only the data sources listed for the techniques that I'm interested in, which then gives you a list of data sources per technique, and then you can group by how many techniques are needed, how many different data sources are required to pick up all of the techniques of interest to you. So I did this, but I did a little bit different of a way. I pulled all of the techniques out, and I was trying to ask the question, well, which techniques are most commonly listed across all of the various things, right? In other words, if you were to say, I'm not going to prioritize anything, I just want to do the best I can with the top 10 data sources, what would those things be? And so when I pulled that information, this is what I got. This is probably not something that's going to be surprising to you. We have API monitoring, of course. We need to know what attackers are doing when they're interacting with our services, authentication logs, file monitoring, net flow, network protocol analysis, packet capture. So basically the 3 levels of network data right here. Process monitoring, what's actually running. Shocking that that's the most one, right? Of course we want to know that stuff. Process command line parameters, when processes actually use the network, Windows registry, and Windows event logs. This, if nothing else, if you're not doing what I'm saying, should probably be your core set of data sources you should look at, because these are the ones that give you the most coverage across all the techniques, of course ignoring prioritization of what you should do. But I thought that was an interesting kind of aside, so I wanted to pull that in and put that in the presentation as well. According to what they have categorized, these are the most useful data sources across all techniques in general. After we have that data collection, great. Now we're in the position to ideally catch these sorts of attacks, right? But the next step is, of course, we have to develop an analytic that measures that data that's coming in, because just because you've collected process creation and command line parameters and arguments, that doesn't mean you're going to detect anything. You still need to have the analytics that go with it. MITRE actually has several efforts that go with this as well. And so if you look up MITRE CAR, as in the Cyber Analytics Repository, or BAZAR, which is the Bro/Zeek attack-based analytics and reporting repository, you will find that they also have given you multiple options for analytic logic to go with these things. So they will say, pick up your API monitoring logs and then apply this logic to them to catch this specific technique. And so they're really, really guiding you down the way here. If you don't have blue team members that know exactly what they're looking for, this part is also included as well. So down on the bottom there, I have an example of a PowerShell-based one, right? So it's kind of like the pseudocode that you can just translate into whatever analytic language you have, but it's easy enough to read and kind of understand. You know, filter for processes where the executable is PowerShell and the parent is not explorer.exe. So maybe we're looking for PowerShell spawn from questionable other sources like Office or something like that. You get a phishing macro coming in, people open that Word document, they say, yep, enable the macro then says fire up a PowerShell. This kind of thing would catch that, right? Now, the third part of how we can use attack to improve operations is guiding us through different types of assessments for the blue team or for the SOC or whatever you call it. The way I look at this, I broke this down into 4 areas, and yes, some of these things have a considerable amount of overlap, but I'm just going to kind of define these in a way that I think is useful for explaining the differences between each one and how each one kind of uniquely helps in its own way. The first thing I want to say is there are different ways of assessing a SOC, right? If you have a brand new blue team and you throw adversary emulation at them, what do you think is going to happen, right? They're going to get railroaded. And so generally when you have a very new team that has never tested themselves before, you want to try something maybe a little less difficult. And so we start down here, right? We say maybe some atomic testing of rules. Well, MITRE definitely helps with that. The next step up, maybe we go up to purple teaming, where we kind of do a collaborative test and the blue team and the red team is working together. Those things help build confidence and prove in a different way than atomic testing that these things are going to then work in the real world. Once you leave purple teaming, then you start to get into pen testing and red teaming. And this is, I would say, where you draw the line between we're pretty confident it's going to be detected and we're not confident. The stuff on this side of the line is generally announced, and over here we're getting into unannounced testing territory. And so this is why I say, right about here, well, you're doing an intermediate job, right? At least. You think you can probably catch a real attack. And so on the right side of this, we are more simulating a real attack, where on the left side of this, we're doing a little bit more programmatic assessment of each of the specific analytics we have and different kind of horizontal and vertical coverage of tactics and techniques. And so I want to walk through each of these things and how MITRE ATT&CK can help you do these. So the first item here is atomic testing. We have a lot of analytics implemented in all sorts of places, right? The SIM is applying analytics to logs coming in. We have IDS applying analytics to network traffic. We have EDR applying analytics to what's happening on your endpoint, all sorts of stuff, right? Each of these has some assumption about what it was configured to look for and that those configurations won't change. we have situations like, as time goes on, environmental drift, right? Naturally, the network will change, the applications on it will change. If your configuration of these tools don't change with it, you may leave blind spots out there. So one of the things you want to do, and one of the things you can do with ATT&CK, is use that prioritization to say, what are the analytics we have that catch all of these specific techniques, specifically the prioritized ones, right? And then run them and say, did the alert actually go off, right? Checking to make sure that your appliances are functioning as expected. So security validation in some respects here, right? This is something we can do manually, and we probably should do manually when we first create these analytics for the very first time, and automate it so that over time we continuously understand, yes, our analytics are still working. Quick preview, in a couple months I will be coming out with another paper that will be more centered around the security validation topic, but we'll leave that for another day. Mainly for now, we want to say continuous testing is a good idea, right? And there are tools out there that can help you do it, and there's plenty of stuff that can be done, both free and open source, as commercial as well, that can help make this easier and a consistent thing that you're doing. Beyond that, purple teaming. Once you have tested these individual rules and you're like, yeah, I'm pretty sure they're going to work, right? We can bring it up to the next level of realism. That progression I showed earlier to me was really several steps up in the realism ladder, right? Atomic testing, not super realistic. Purple teaming, still not necessarily realistic, but the attackers and the attacks start to be a little more consistent and themed and grouped around a certain kind of maybe a campaign or something like that. So what we're doing with purple teaming a lot of the time, at least in the way that I do purple teaming, is getting the blue team and getting the red team and having them sit together at the same table and come up with a plan of an attack campaign. So they can try to act like an attacker, they can try to test all your prioritized items, they can try to test a single attack tactic kind of vertically up and down the entire spectrum. It's really whatever you want to test, but it's an interactive kind of back and forth announced test where red teamers are going to be saying, here, I'm going to launch this kind of phishing attack, and then I'm going to launch this kind of phishing attack, and then I'm going to launch this kind of phishing attack. And the idea is kind of complete coverage to understand all of the ways you might receive a phishing email. Will they all be caught? Or will they all be maybe allowed but detected, or will they be totally missed? And so a purple team to me is kind of a way of iteratively going through either horizontally or vertically a planned set of campaigns to do focused testing on a specific set of items, and aligning this with tactics and techniques that you've decided to be important is the obvious answer here, right? MITRE should guide what you are purple teaming. That's really what we want to do. The other part of purple teaming is it's not just a one-time thing. When you do a purple team test, you record the results and you say what was prevented, what was detected, and what was totally missed, and you write that down, right? And that's one metric that the SOC can report outwards to the business and say, here's how good we're doing. But we want to do this testing frequently, right? More than once. So periodically, we will do maybe an assessment in Q1, and we run campaign A and campaign B. And these different campaigns may be broken into different sub-techniques that we run, right? However you decide you want to do this. Campaign A might be all of the phishing techniques. Campaign B could be all of the exfil techniques. Or it could be pretending to be one adversary versus another adversary. It could be a ransomware scenario. It could be whatever you want, right? We test it, we record the results, and then we do it again, and we do it again, and we do it again. And hopefully, as we report our success rate against things that are blocked, detected, and not detected, we see an improvement over time, right? So that's really the goal here, and MITRE is, the attack framework is going to be guiding what you should probably prioritize for these types of tests. And so each test can be more focused on a specific part of the attack, or one specific technique, or one specific set of ways of doing a technique, really whatever you want, as long as you're continuing to test these things over and over. That's what we need. Then, once we have some confidence, we've done atomic testing, we do continuous atomic testing, we've done purple teaming. The SOC is now sitting at a point where it should be pretty confident that it does catch real stuff, because you've had quote unquote real attackers, a red team or a penetration testing group, right, going at your network with a purple teaming exam and throwing their real attacks at it, and you are catching them, hopefully. And so you should be fairly confident at this point that when you move into something that is maybe a little more surprise driven, that you should still be able to effectively catch those things. And so that's when we make the step. In my, advice is make this step after you have this confidence, from purple teaming to red team. I've seen numerous organizations that say we have to get a pen test, right? Because the industry tells us pen tests are good. Well, what I often say is, I turn to an analyst, I'm like, so if you were going to pen test this network, do you know what you would do? And they're like, oh yeah, totally. And they rattle it off, right? We got shared passwords, we got stuff that's not patched, we got whatever. I'm like, all right, let me save you some money on that pen test. They're going to break in, they're going to use Mimikatz, they're going to dump passwords, they're going to use exploits, they're going to do this and that. There's no point in doing a pen test if you know how it's going to end. It's expensive, it takes a lot of time, and it's not necessarily the right move. Now, the exception to that rule is if you're screaming about getting fixes and no one will support you without third parties kind of showing the real danger there. I can see that argument, although it's silly. Sometimes that's what has to happen. You have to have a third party come in and say, like, here you go, yep, you actually do have a problem, even though you've been screaming it the whole time. So to be the most cost efficient, I would say moving into red team should happen once the SOC actually thinks they can do a pretty reasonable job. When we go into red teaming, as I've defined it here, is kind of threat model driven assessments. And so when I say that, what I mean is the SOC should sit there and think, all right, what do we have that's going to likely be attacked? Are they going to come after our customer data? Are they going to come after our money with business email compromise attempts? Are they going to try to hit us with ransomware? What are our biggest fears? And then those are the things that you can try to red team, right? So we often do this, we call it flags, right? If you're doing a red team assessment, you can say like, one of the flags is, can you get into the manufacturing network and stop a production line? Can you steal a formula for something that we're producing for a vaccine? Can you steal customer data and get it out without anyone knowing? And so the red team is going to be focused on those specific scenarios that the business is most worried about. And they're only going to use the tactics and techniques kind of required to get to those specific flags. I would say this is a little bit different than pen testing in that most of the time when I see pen testing, it's more exploratory of let's look at everything and let's kind of see what's possible here. I realize that definition is not perfectly clear and not necessarily agreed by everyone, but that's kind of how I like to differentiate the two. Is pen testing is more of what's possible here, whereas red teaming is, are these specific high risk items possible? And so what a red team does is test the SOC detection capabilities the same way a purple team does, the same way the other things do, but it's unannounced. And so it is a real test of not only the detection capability, but will the SOC actually identify that as an attack, and can they respond? When I teach Sec 450, I talk about the core pieces of the SOC being collection, detection, triage, investigation, and incident response. In the first two types of tests, we are testing collection and we're testing detection and prevention really as well. When it gets to red teaming, we're actually testing the rest of the chain. Is the blue team actually going to triage these things as they should? Because they don't know that it's not a real attack yet. Are they going to investigate these and falsely call them a false positive and maybe be like, oh, that was nothing, when it actually was a real attack? And then if they do identify it as an attack, are they going to be able to then respond within the time that would be reasonable if that attack were to actually be happening? And so when it comes to stepping from purple teaming to red teaming, I think that is the benefit, and that is what you should be focusing on is, did the blue team actually respond as though this were a real attack? Did they identify it properly? And of course, what are you testing is going to be based on the capabilities and the mitigations and the data sources and all the attack techniques and threat groups and all the stuff that is given to you by the attack matrix. So again, it helps guide this sort of thing as well. And then the final item here, I would say this probably has the most overlap with the previous slide, red teaming and adversary emulation. Adversary emulation, I would say, is a form of red team, but it is a more specific way, at least the way that I normally talk about it. The red teaming I just described is kind of goal focused, despite whether there's a threat group out there that's after that thing. What we probably want to do is when we red team actually say, well, what do we have that's high risk, and is there a group out there that wants it? Because if there is something that's high risk, but no one's going to try to take it from you, then it's not really that much of a threat, right? And so with adversary emulation, this is where we take a red team, basically the same process, but we say, well, what attackers are out there, and we're going to try to perfectly act like them and go for their goals, whatever those goals happen to be. So we're going to say, oh, we're going to act like APT1. This is where attack is a huge, huge help as well. you can literally go into the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator and select threat group APT1, and it lights up all of the techniques that APT1 has been known to use throughout all of time. That is your plan for adversary emulation. In the past, this has been an extremely time-consuming thing to figure out, right? How do I act like APT1? What does APT1 even do? What do they want? Well, now this is done for us. So adversary emulation has been made much, much easier by the attack groups and all the data that has been provided by this. And so this is the highest on the realism spectrum, right? We're pretending to be a real group with real goals using real techniques, and if you can, even the real tools and techniques that they would actually use against you. And so we're picking an attack path, and the red team is going to emulate that specific threat group, and hopefully multiple threat groups across time, all the ones you're concerned with, as realistically as possible. And this will tell you, as close as you possibly can, are you doing well against the real thing, quote unquote. If your SOC is passing adversary emulation tests, that's about as soundly as you can sleep, right? You've tested. Do you have the right data sources? Can you catch it unannounced? Will you triage it correctly? Will you investigate it correctly? Will you respond correctly? And can all of this be identified and tied back to a threat group? So with these testing types and progression, here's kind of the summary of how I see each of these, the pros and cons of this. Atomic testing, it is not realistic because we're just running a single test and we're saying, does this thing work? The good news is it's very quick and easy. It's rapid to do. We can automate this. There are tools out there that help us automate this and run tests for this. And this is, as a new team, where you should be focusing, right? Just getting some assurance that your stuff is going to work on the most basic level. Once you have that, you move to the purple teaming. This is where you use real methods and you say, hey, pen testers, right? Use your real tools against us, and let's see if this actually works. And so with that, we're going to be doing a slower exhaustive test, but it is going to be more real. It is announced, so we still know it's coming, and it doesn't have that aspect. So it is really just kind of testing the first couple pieces of that SOC workflow that I was talking about, collection and detection. It's not going to test your triage capabilities, your incident response, but it will tell you whether you detected it or not. And it's a collaborative, interactive activity. The other thing I didn't mention about purple teaming is it's awesome for training. If you have new people that have joined your blue team and they do not know what an attack looks like in your organization, on your network, using your tools, maybe you got a new SIM, something like that, whatever it is, these are real attacks coming in, right, quote unquote real. They will show up with the very, very similar kind of view that you would see of the real thing. So it's a great thing that doubles as a training tool, and a lot of people tend to get a lot of use out of it in that respect as well. So it does double duty. Then we step into red team. Of course, this is high realism. It's unannounced. We are testing the rest of the SOC chain. It may be less exhaustive than purple teaming, because purple teaming, like I said, it's more either fully horizontal or fully vertical, maybe in one specific campaign across tactics or techniques. Red teaming is more like, we're going to do whatever we can to get to the goal, and we're not going to go far and wide. We're just going to do the minimum possible to see if we can cause the impact that the business is most worried about. This is where you get to mature teams that are pretty complex, pretty confident that they can do what they need to do there. And it is more expensive, it is more complex and time consuming. And then ultimately moving into the adversary emulation version of that, which is where you pick the specific techniques. This is the highest realism, it's the most complex to plan, but that complexity has dropped significantly because of MITRE ATT&CK. So if there's anything I want you to take away from this, it's the adversary emulation has got way, way easier. Go look at the threat groups and the way they've categorized them, broken them down into tactics, techniques, and now sub-techniques as well. If you can pull this off and you can do adversary emulation and you can catch it, respond to it, you should be able to sleep pretty soundly, right? This is probably the ultimate test that you can submit your SOC to, and if they're passing it, you're doing a great job. Common challenges to all of this. When it comes to the matrix, you may look at these things and say, oh man, there's like 200 things to do here. What am I gonna start with, right? Prioritization is the key, and I've already said it several times. Do not try to take on everything at once. Take on the items that you know are relevant to you. And even within that, you may need to prioritize and say, what are the key items that all of our attackers are doing that are easiest for us to cover right now? A lot of the times you need to look at this at multiple timelines. What can we do right now? What can we maybe get done in a month? And what is going to be kind of pie in the sky? We'll get it done in the next year. prioritize things that way based on how important they are to you and how much coverage they're going to provide. Each data source tells you how important it is, right? So that can help you do this sort of thing. Over definition, that's another one. Getting wrapped up in the details when you try to measure how good are you at picking up each one of these techniques. I've been on teams in the past that kind of struggled with the best way to do this. Oftentimes the approach is, let's test this technique and then we'll put it on some sort of scale of 1 to 5 or whatever. Did it prevent, detect, or not block this at all? Keep it simple. That's kind of my guidance here. You can get really wrapped around getting detailed with this and to the point where you might end up not getting the answers you're looking for in a reasonable amount of time. Partial answers are so much better than no answers at all that I would say even having an imperfect solution for grading yourself is way, way better than worrying about getting it perfect. So that's kind of my guidance on that one. And then think about, obviously, consistent and automatic updates. This is a living document of sorts. So as these things get added, how is your team going to stay aware of these? MITRE is constantly announcing these, and so one answer is probably going to be, we're going to watch the MITRE attack Twitter handle, we're going to watch the attack matrix, we're going to pull the versions of it programmatically and look for differences. Just make sure you have a way planned of doing this, right? Because when it changes, you don't want to be left in the dust on that. They are new attack techniques and new groups associated with them, so this is not a one-time activity only. Keys to success for this, the ways that you can get as quickly towards the goal in this as you can, leveraging the security tools you already have that already label tactics and techniques for you. Start here, right? This work has been done. Yes, you can go back and try to retroactively tag a bunch of analytics with all of the attack techniques, but like I said before, do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Partial answers in InfoSec are so much better than no answer at all, and fast answers are better than slow answers, so use what you have. Start with anything that you already have and build your picture from there. Even if it's imperfect, do not get worried about that. Try to balance your data sources across network and host-based. You will need both of these things. A lot of these attack techniques will be something you can pick up on the host only. Other ones will be things you can only pick up on the network. And so make sure you have some coverage across both of those domains. You will need both of those to pick up the complete picture. Network is necessary to see lateral movement and things like that, and endpoints are generally required for seeing what processes are running and stuff of that nature. So both of those pieces will be important. Don't have a lopsided kind of collection strategy there if you can avoid it. EDR tools and Zeek and all those kind of like outside the open source things make this easy if you don't have the budget to do so. And there's plenty of outstanding commercial options that can drop in place and make this real simple for you. Using attack for historical measurements and trending. This is the other thing I mentioned at the end of purple teaming. You want to measure yourself. You want to produce metrics on where were you before and where are you now. One of the things the blue team needs to do is constantly justify its existence, and so this is a great way to do it. You can take the attack techniques and say, here's where we were, here's what we could catch last quarter, and now we are here, we have made this improvement. Look, we are objectively becoming better in our detection and prevention capabilities. And so definitely trumpet those improvements out there and try to announce all of the good work you've been doing, all of the new analytics you've been writing, how the adversary simulation and red teaming and purple teaming, how all of that has changed you and made you better. Other things that I want to mention before we finish up here. There are some resources that can help you do this. One of them, one of the big ones, is Attack Navigator. A lot of people have seen Attack Navigator, but they may have not realized what they were supposed to do with it and just thought it made pretty pictures. It is actually a lot more functional than you might expect when you first look at it. A lot of times people just kind of click around and use it to see the tactics and unfold and unfold things and colorize stuff. You can do a lot more than that. And so, especially with the new version right now that just came out, version 3.1, which has sub-techniques built in, here is the type of stuff you can do. Attack Navigator is a layer-based interface, and it has those groups and those mitigations and stuff built into it. So what you should be doing is something like we have down here. You can make one layer on one tab. You can go into this little box right here, and you can click, show me all the things that APT1 does. And then that is your APT1 layer. Then you make a new layer, right? And you say, APT32 is also interesting to us. You make a new layer, you click on that, it highlights all those boxes. And then you can do the same thing with whatever other groups you're interested in. And then once you have individual layers for all of your groups, then you can make a combined layer where you go in and say, well, after selecting all of these things, here is the put together version of everything we expect these groups might do to us, which is your kind of total threat view across all of the groups, right? So we have this intelligence built in. When you click on that icon, this is what you see. Literally, you hit select, it highlights all the boxes that are for that specific threat group's techniques. And all you have to do is colorize them how you want, score them how you want. There's a scoring feature, and so you just give it some amount of points, 10 points or whatever, and each layer has a bunch of techniques separately that have 10 points on them, and then from there you can make a combined layer where all of those points are added together and ultimately lead to something where you see all of them on one visualization, which is really nice. You can do colors, you can do comments, all of that. Here's how it works, right? When you hit create a new layer, you can say create layer from other layers. And so when you do that, you just write a simple expression. It pops up little letters here, A, B, C. All right, well, use the scores I put on A, B, and C and make a new layer out of that. Boom, there we go. So if you are a company that is scared of APT1, APT32, FIN5, and you go through this exercise, well, now on your fourth layer, you have created a combined view of all of the techniques that are the most important for you. And when you mouse over these things, it would say like the red ones maybe have 30 points, versus these that have like 20 points or 10 points or 0 points if they're white. And so this is how you do that prioritization. It helps do this for you. So all of that work I said about figure out what groups are doing what, this is your way of visualizing that and making it very easy to operationalize. Other things that you can do. Resources-TRAM, this is the threat report and attack mapper. It is a beta tool that they have just released, and it uses automation to parse out the text in threat reports. So previously what we would have to do is read through a threat report, kind of circle what's there, and then say, oh, obfuscate executable code. Well, that sounds like this technique, obfuscated files or information. TRAM has this language built in and can automate picking some of these things up and say, oh, this looks like it's doing this thing. And so you have less work to do when you're trying to produce your own threat intelligence from scratch from a threat report. And so you can go download that tool from GitHub as well and have it assist you in producing that new intelligence, which I think is really cool. So hopefully that's something that turns into a general release and becomes a standard tool because, of course, anything that is time-saving, big help to the blue team. So with that, we are to the end. Attack, hopefully, as you have seen here, has caught on for a very, very good reason. It tells us who is out there. It tells us what those groups are capable of in terms of tactics, in terms of techniques. It tells us the tools they use. Each tool is broken down into tactics and techniques. It tells us how to stop those things with mitigations. It tells us how we pick those things up with data sources. There are visualizing tools like Navigator to help us see these. It can help us plan how to assess each item and the different ways of doing so. And it standardizes the language across all teams on Earth for describing different types of attacks. So this is one of those things that if you haven't understood why it was such a big deal before, hopefully you understand now. This is an incredibly, incredibly useful thing and a great contribution to the community. So thank you very much for MITRE ATT&CK folks, if you're on the call, for putting in all the effort for doing this. This is a great, great way of categorizing this stuff. Vendors as well, thank you for picking up on this, right? This makes our lives as defenders easier, right? We love that, this is something that we can start to make metrics, we can do benchmarks with against other organizations, we can start to understand attacks and communicate them in common, right? The more vendors pick this up, the more this is going to become the standard and the more defending will become easier for all of us. And so with that, we have made it to the end. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A on the side there. I'd be happy to answer those. If you have anything after the fact, I'm easy to find online. And with that, thank you again to our sponsors, and thank you for attending the webinar. If you have anything, let me know, and I'm ready to answer questions.
All right, thanks, John, for that great presentation. We do have quite a few questions here, so I'll jump right in. The first one asks, how is the status of the use of weak signals in this stage? Question mark, and then it says CTI.
I'm sorry, it was a little bit fuzzy. Did you say weak signals?
Yes, and you know what I'll do? I'll copy and paste it really quick into the chat window. Just take me just a minute here.
I'm going to preface this with, I am not a threat intelligence person. My focus is SOC and blue teaming. So I will say weak signals is not let's see, how is the status of the use of weak signals in this stage, CTI? I'm not exactly familiar with that terminology. If that is a kind of a way of saying like how are they categorizing stuff that may not be a clear representation of one thing or another, I don't exactly know how they handled those sorts of items. But unfortunately, threat intelligence and the terminology around that is not my forte. I'm more of a blue team operational kind of person. So I'm sure that's something that could be directed towards the attack team and they could potentially answer that. But unfortunately, that one I'm not familiar with.
All right, thanks. The next one asks, I've also used attack mitigation mapping to see what controls I might want to consider. Has there been an update to the mitigations component?
There was an update to the mitigations component before it was not included in the attack navigator, and now it is. And so if you haven't been able to go in and click on those mitigations that you have before, I didn't mention this specifically, but what you can also do in attack navigator is click on the mitigations you have in place, and it will highlight what techniques those cover as well. What you can't do is do that with data sources yet, but I'm hoping that that is something that's coming up with that new update for the data sources. But yes, at least in that sense, the mitigations component has been updated and made into an object in MITRE that you can use for kind of programmatic manipulation of data, at least in Attack Navigator.
All right, thank you. This next question refers to slide 22. It says purple team has components of both blue and red team, right? Wouldn't that be after red team / pen test?
I would say no to this. Yes, well, okay. First of all, yes, it does have components of blue and red, but would it be after? No. The reason I don't put it after is that I think the progression of testing should be about building up confidence and not wasting money doing a test that's so complex it's just going to cut right through the sock like a hot knife through butter. If you ever talk with pen testers, and I talk to a lot of pen testers, they will tell you they nearly always win. And so with that being the comment I hear from most pen testers, what I usually say is, well, clearly the SOC wasn't ready for this. And so if we're going to be moving into stuff where we're doing red teaming and pen testing, I would rather have it be something that's likely to, be a significant realistic test that the blue team has a chance at stopping, which is why I say having a collaborative test between red and blue kind of together, where red team says, here's what we're going to do to you and tell you it's coming. And then they can, you can test if those things are going to function in your environment. I think that's a good first step before going into the unannounced, likely to work in a lot of cases, much more hardcore testing. That's kind of why I put it the way it was out there.
All right, thanks. The next one asks, why is adversary emulation the most complex to plan?
So I guess I did say it that way. That being said, also the point of this presentation was it's much less complex than it used to be. Previous to this kind of really good organization of data, we had to do a ton of research. So we had to have threat intelligence available that said what all these attackers were after. We had to categorize the types of tactics and techniques. And so getting an adversary emulation test that was anywhere near realistic in the past was an exercise of having a threat intel team, having a pen test team that was actually capable of being good enough for that sort of thing. And it still is a bit of an exercise in that, right? Even if you know the the tactics and techniques that an attacker is going to use, you still have to be able to use those tools yourself. Just because an attacker can pull out some custom malware doesn't mean your red team is going to have access to that custom malware. So it still is complex for them to kind of plan, like, how are we going to look as much as possible like them? Even if they know the tactics and techniques, it is not necessarily the easiest thing pretending to be, a nation state backed, really well-funded, zero-day wielding kind of, advanced attack group, if that's what you're trying to emulate, right? So sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, I guess, but in general, that's kind of why I placed it at that part of the spectrum.
All right, well, a couple of comments here. It says, such a great presentation, thanks. And thank you, John, for responding to my question. So with that, we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much, John, for your great presentation. And to Anomaly, Attack IQ, Corelight, Cyberproof, Extra Hop, Infoblocks, Logarithm, RSA, and Threat Quotient for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.